is our Dharma? What is our quest? How's it going, everyone? This is Matt from Dharma Nights. So I recorded a walkthrough and review of a cheat sheet that I put together for my current 300 level Yoga Teacher Trainee students. There's a final exam at the end of their 300 level Yoga Teacher Training program, and I usually put together a roundup of the most important takeaways that I want them to have by the end of the course. So this ended up being something like an hour and 20 minutes long, way longer than I expected. So I'm cutting this up into a few different slices. And for those of you who are not in a yoga teacher training program, maybe you still enjoy this kind of stuff. Hopefully, either way, it has value for you. But certainly for my students, you guys should definitely have a bite-sized resource now that should help you feel a little bit more confident about some of the stuff that I included in that sheet. Namaste. So my next question for this exam prep is, why are books written in sutra format, like the Yoga Sutras or the Hatha Yoga Pradipika? Why are they so short, and why are they so dense in meaning? So just by way of explication, for those who might not know this, written pieces like the Yoga Sutras or the Hatha Yoga Pradipika or Brahma Sutras or any other number of sutras which you might encounter in your yogic journey or as your journey as a spiritual seeker who's trying to learn from this set of Indian traditions. The sutra format is short and it's dense. There's not a lot of fluff, okay? So if you didn't know that, that's why. If you buy these books in the modern setting, most of the book is going to be commentary. There's a small slice of that book which is the actual original material. And the rest of it is usually commentary, where someone's explaining it or expanding it. But the things that were actually preserved and reproduced were usually short, dense, rich with meaning, and here's why. First, they were meant to be short enough so that they could be memorized. The whole thing is usually memorized by teachers and gurus, and then eventually by students, so they can recite every line. Next, each sutra is meant to be carefully unpacked and taught by a teacher or guru. So, as you're sitting at the feet of the teacher, that particular day, the lecture might just be about one sutra. In some of these traditions, they might lecture all week, all month on just that one sutra and just keep looking at it from different angles and teaching how to embody it, right? And that's what makes it so dense and so rich. It's meant to be carefully unpacked and taught by a teacher or guru. So the next reason that these are so short and dense, they're less like philosophical essays and more like instruction manuals. So, back in the West, Aristotle, he writes these beautiful but very technical explanations of his thinking, and people pass that around in Europe and the rest of the world for centuries to come, right? Like for a very, very long time, and that's great. But these aren't like that. They're less wordy, they're less expansive, they pack more of a punch with less, and it's not just to flesh out ideas, it's usually for embodied practices. So these sutras are usually telling you, here's how you do something. So, for example, the Yoga Sutras, they're explaining what the 8 limbs of yoga are, but also how to actually practice each of those 8 limbs. Not in atomic level of detail, because that's for the guru to teach you, right? That's why this is still even though these are written materials, that's why this is still very much rooted in an oral culture, because there is no substitute for actually learning at the feet of the teacher or guru. So these sutras are just to give them a format and a reference, but all the good stuff is in person. And in this way of thinking, there is no way around that. There's no shortcut. You got to learn this stuff from the teacher and the guru, and these sutras are are basically just like their lesson plans. That's it. Another reason why these sutra formatted books are so short, the role of the author is not the same as it is in the West. So people would assign a lot of importance to saying like, oh, this is what Plato wrote and this is what Plato thought, or oh, this is what Aristotle wrote and this is what Aristotle thought. And in many ways we get to see so much of these individual writers and thinkers' personality coming through in their works. We kind of get to know them in a certain sense. But in this tradition, the individual, and by extension the individual author, is not the important part. And that's why many times there'll be names of authorship which it's not even clear that it's an individual's name in every circumstance. Like, for example, in the Mahabharata, it's written by Veda Vyasa, who ostensibly, not only is he an individual, but he's an individual who actually shows up in his own story. But there's also this idea that the material was compiled at some point, just like the Vedas were compiled. It wasn't written by one person. And Veda Vyasa is said to be not the author of the Vedas, but the compiler of the Vedas. And he's attributed with authorship of this massive book, the Mahabharata, but the implication is also that he compiled the story, right? So he's not the important part, even though that's a bit ironic in the case of the Mahabharata, because he actually is literally the grandfather of some of the characters. But in this tradition, the individual author is not the important detail. What they're communicating is, like the living tradition behind what they're writing. That's the important thing. So they're just a transmitter. The final reason why these books are so short is the disciplined writing excludes unnecessary fluff or personal contributions of writers. And I touched on this in that last bullet point. In written cultures, you end up getting piles and piles and piles of commentary, and like suddenly you get individual commentators who you can even see like their own identity emerging in the commentary. And this is something that sometimes you see, for example, in some of the old Chinese texts like Art of War or the Tao Te Ching or something like this. There's individual commentators who themselves are sort of like celebrity scholars, and you see their own personality by way of their own interpretations kind of shining through. But these works don't have any of that. It's not really appropriate here. It's very resistant to individual personalities putting their own spin on things, which is something that happens all over the world for other writing traditions, especially the easier it is for things to be written, or when written technology evolves. So this sutra format really resists all of that stuff. It keeps things as close to the tradition as possible without individual egos, individual authors getting exploded in importance beyond what they should. So my next question is, what are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana? And these are great Indian epics, often compared to the considerably shorter Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So just as one example, the Mahabharata is something like 8 or 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. So it's huge. But they're like these Greek epics in that they are both the products of orally transmitted material. So, you can go to certain parts of Greece and people will still recite musically the Iliad in exactly the same way that one of their musical poets would have done it way back when, right? They do it the same way. So the Mahabharata and the Ramayana have a very similar origin. At some point, the actual text of the Mahabharata, like as it's being compiled over time, grows way beyond the initial older core work, which is called Jaya. So it's sort of like, an asteroid goes through space, and over time it collects through a process of accretion all this other matter and eventually becomes a moon or becomes a planet, right? That's sort of what happened with the core of these stories. They just collected more and more contributions until they reach sort of a large final form. But at the root, they're basically much like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're works of great epic poetry. And, so we have the Vedas, which are like rituals and hymns, more or less. The Upanishads, which are kind of philosophical writings of speculation and teaching, which kind of like synthesize that material and teach it in review. And then you have stories like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which are actual narrative stories. But these narrative stories also contain a lot of these concepts and embody them and flesh them out in a narrative. So you get to see how karma works. You get to see how people either fulfill Dharma or violate Dharma. You get to see the doctrine of reincarnation happening in these stories. You get to see how a god might take an avatar form. You get to see how the devas and the asuras have their conflicts. You get to see all kinds of stuff, right? You get to see how like the great Indian elements or Mahabhutas interact in the world and flesh it out, So my next question is, how did the Mahabharata and the Ramayana originate? And I touched on this in my last answer actually I completely covered it, but I'll say it again anyway. They originated through a core of orally transmitted stories, which are later elaborated and compiled in written form. So which of these two great books contains the Bhagavad Gita? In other words, does the Mahabharata or the Ramayana contain the Bhagavad Gita as just one of its chapters? And the answer is the Mahabharata. So the Bhagavad Gita has its own life as its own book. It's often considered, one of the very few almost universal or universally recognized quote-unquote Hindu spiritual sacred texts. But the Bhagavad Gita itself is just one exploded chapter or episode of the Mahabharata, of the greater Mahabharata epic. So that's rather interesting. Which avatar of Vishnu is the protagonist in the Ramayana? And that is Ram, the Prince of Ayodhya. So I also mentioned that he's in exile, right? Because that takes a little bit of expanded discussion, but the whole reason for the story of the Ramayana is there's this perfect Prince Ram who, to no fault of his own, is exiled. He's followed into exile in the forest by his brother and his wife. His wife gets kidnapped by a very powerful Rakshasa named Ravana, and then most of the story is how Ram has adventures while collecting an army made of monkeys and other animals who are like semi-divine in a certain sense, and eventually winning back his wife. And then some things happen after that, but we won't get into it. But in a nutshell, that's the Ramayana. It's about Ram, the Prince of Ayodhya, in exile. And of course, Ram is an avatar of Vishnu. So who is the monkey god who devotedly helps and serves Ram in that epic story of the Ramayana? And that would be Hanuman. So Hanuman is the semi-divine monkey who is a devoted bhakta, or like devotee of Ram. He meets Ram in the forest and completely unselfishly devotes himself to Ram in Ram's quest to win back Sita, his kidnapped wife. And Hanuman himself is nearly limitless in power. He's like, the ancient Hindu Superman prototype, but he always forgets that he's divine, mostly out of defense for the rest of the world, because when he was young, he was more powerful than he could manage well. So he was given limitations where he would forget how powerful he was, and he has to be reminded that he's like limitless. Hey, Hanuman, you can fly. Oh yes, I can fly. Hey, Hanuman, you can lift an entire mountain. Oh yes, I can lift an entire mountain. Right? But he's not only the prototype for superheroes in this sort of way of thinking, but also he's like the ideal image of a bhakta, of a devotee. Because once he meets Ram, he's completely devoted to Ram for the rest of his life. He does nothing else for himself. Everything is devoted to Ram. Okay, so the next question. Who are the Pandavas in the Mahabharata? Pandavas are the 5 royal princes who are the sons of Pandu. They're unjustly exiled from their birth kingdom of Hastinapura multiple times throughout their life. They're also cheated out of the kingdom they created for themselves out of arid wilderness, and that kingdom is called Indraprashta. They created it out of a wasteland, basically, or out of forests, which they had to burn down. And this cheating that they have to endure, where they're cheated out of their kingdom, they're cheated out of their freedom, etc., that's all done to them by their jealous cousins, the Kauravas. So their cousins, the Kauravas, who are the sons of blind King Dhritarashtra, their uncle. They are jealous. They have it out for the Pandavas. They scheme to get them exiled several times. They cheat them out of their kingdom, and eventually they go to war with them. So the Pandavas have divine parentage due to a mystical mantra used by their mother, whose name is Kunti. So it's a story that I'm not going to have time to get into necessarily, but their father, when he himself is in exile, is cursed by a rishi or a forest mystic. And the curse is basically that if he ever tries to embrace either of his two wives in love, that he'll die instantly. So that basically means he's got a life of celibacy ahead of him in exile, which for a king is a terrible fate. And in this worldview, that's extra terrible because in a sense, it's thought that he will go to a sort of hell if he can't have children. So, as it happens, one of his wives, Kunti, has a mystical mantra that she learned as a young sort of teenage girl, and she uses this mantra to immaculately conceive with Yama, who's the god of death and Dharma, with Vayu, the god of the wind, with Indra, the king of the Devas, who's like also the lightning thrower. And then she shares this mantra with her sister wife, Madri, who invokes the twin Ashwin gods, who's like the golden-eyed twin gods. And so Yama is the divine father of Yudhishthira. Vayu is the divine father of Bhima. Indra is the divine father of Arjuna, who's one of the two main protagonists of the Bhagavad Gita. And their brothers Nakula and Sahadeva are the sons of the Ashwins. So, who is the Pandava's unknown and abandoned eldest brother? And who is his true father? So, the Pandava's mother, Kunti, when she was young, the whole reason she learned that mystical mantra that I mentioned in that last bullet point is because she was kind to a rishi who, she served the rishi excellently with perfect manners, etc., etc. So the rishi kind of irresponsibly gave her the boon that she could use this mystical mantra to call down a god and have a child by that god. And here she is, a curious teenage girl, isn't even completely sure that this mantra is going to work. So what does she do? She tests it, and all of a sudden Surya, the sun god, gives her a son, but it's like a teenage pregnancy moment. Oh no, in this society, that's a disaster. It's going to be a problem. So what does she do? She abandons the baby, like Moses gets abandoned, like in a little basket of reeds sent down the river. It's exactly the same thing. So that baby is the eldest brother of the Pandavas, even though he's born in obscurity because he was abandoned by his mother, Kunti. And that character is Karna, the archer, whose adoptive father is a charioteer. So even though he's royalty, without knowing it, he's born into an adopted family of low status, right? But as he's growing up, he knows he's meant for more. He's got this like warrior spirit bubbling up inside of him, and he doesn't understand why. But he grows up to be an incredible archer. He's the rival of Arjuna, who's supposed to be the best archer around. They meet each other. They instantly hate each other. And this leads Karna to become the best friend of the Pandava's nemesis cousin, Duryodhana, who's like the eldest Kaurava cousin. He's the worst. So he meets him, and he's like, wow, what a powerful archer. I want him to be my friend. And they become best friends, and that's, beyond the scope of the rest of this lecture for me to tell that story. But as I mentioned, Karna's true father is Surya, the sun god. So again, Kunti tests this mantra that she got for providing excellent service to a rishi. She tests it, as a curious teenage girl, not really fully understanding the consequences. She's given a baby by Surya, the sun god. All the babies that come from this mantra are immaculately conceived, right? So Kunti's always kind of considered like an immaculate virgin, kind of like the Mother Mary is in the Christian tradition. But yeah. So anyway, how are the Pandavas cheated out of their personal freedom and their kingdom by their cousins, the Kauravas? So when the Pandavas have already created their own kingdom out of an arid wasteland and some forest areas that they had to burn down, killing all the animals within the forest to do it. It's very it's a very violent thing to do to the earth and the forest, but it's what's required to build a forest, right? They build this kingdom. It's a wonderful kingdom. They do it with their own hands and their own labor. And then when they go back to visit their jealous cousins, the Kauravas, much later, once they've already established themselves with their own kingdom and all this stuff, the Kauravas had a plot that they were going to cheat at this dice game, which they very casually invited the eldest Pandava brother, Yudhisthira, to play, right? But they have their uncle, Shakuni, who's an expert at cheating at dice, like he's unbeatable at dice. And it's implied that he does this sort of magically, right? He can magically cheat at dice. So the Kauravas use their uncle Shakuni to magically cheat at dice and thus disenfranchise the Pandavas, cheat them out of their kingdom, etc., etc. So yeah, it's all under the framework of like an illegitimate game of dice, which Yudhisthira keeps betting. He's like sort of honor bound to keep betting when he's challenged to bet, but it's also sort of implied that it's a personal failing. So there's different ways to interpret that. But for one reason or another, he keeps getting challenged to gamble. He keeps accepting. Gambles first his kingdom, then his treasures, then his brothers as if they're his property, then himself, and then even his wife Draupadi, who's also the common wife of his brothers. He loses everything in this gambling match. So that is the primary thing that sets the conflict of the Mahabharata in place. So after they go through their exile in the forest for 13 years, then by the time they come back, they want even just one village returned to them, which they were supposed to get all of their kingdom returned to them after their period of exile. But their cousins, the Kauravas, said, we won't even give back a thimbleful of land. Not even that much will we give back. So then Krishna says, okay, it's time for war. Yeah, you guys have to go to war to regain your kingdom. So on that note, where does the Bhagavad Gita primarily take place? So I mentioned earlier, if you remember, the Bhagavad Gita is just one exploded episode out of the greater Mahabharata story. And it's a moment that's expanded on a battlefield, specifically called Kurukshetra. And it's even more specifically like Arjuna and Krishna in the chariot roll up between the two armies. And it's implied that time is paused for the Bhagavad Gita while Krishna is giving this holy discourse and lecture to Arjuna. So it takes place at a battlefield called Kurukshetra between the two armies, and time is paused. Who are the two main characters of the Bhagavad Gita? Arjuna, the archer prince of the Pandavas, and Krishna, who in this capacity is serving as his charioteer. Krishna is, as I mentioned earlier, an avatar of Vishnu, meaning like a god taking human form. And Vishnu is the preserver god of the Hindu Trimurti or Trinity, right? So he's the preserver god who, when he sees the earth is in trouble, he'll periodically come and either directly or indirectly help to wipe the slate clean in terms of those who are acting against Dharma, in particular, like politically powerful people who are doing it. So corrupt kings, corrupt princes, in some cases corrupt Brahmin priests who are abusing their power. The earth is groaning under their corruption, and in many of these story traditions, the earth literally asks Vishnu, like, hey, I'm groaning under the weight of corruption. Can you please come and clean up? And usually this cleanup is done with violence. So, who are the two main characters of the Bhagavad Gita? Are, again, just to review, Arjuna the archer prince, and Krishna, who's voluntarily serving as his charioteer, which is a lower status job than prince. So that's God, like, voluntarily serving in a lower rank. What's the inciting action of the Gita? Done by Arjuna. Arjuna despairs at the reality of going to war with his own kin. Like, it suddenly dawned on him, like, oh, I'm actually going to have to kill my own extended family and his beloved gurus and all that stuff. He despairs verbally about it and then throws down his bow. So usually the simplest answer I get for that, which I honor, is he throws down his bow. How does Krishna react to this inciting action by Arjuna? So how does Krishna react when Arjuna throws down his bow? Krishna says, pick up your bow and fight. And just to expand on that a little, he says, from whence this ignoble cowardice comes. Pick up your bow and fight. So another bullet point I have here is he explains to Arjuna that his words only sound noble, but they miss the ultimate truth of the situation. And that's what gets us into this big, long lecture, which is the Bhagavad Gita.